And we would like to invite questions from the audience. Uriel?
Can you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, my name is Zeb Lavenger, an ecologist. And it's kind of maybe general, although probably more towards the very bird-related talks. But I was curious what you think the relative importance of more direct effects of direct mortalities of some of these extreme environmental conditions. Like when you talked about the Sahel, I didn't hear much about some of these extreme sandstorms that occur during migration that we've shown could really destroy a complete population. But also in other areas, in some of these extreme events that can create direct mortality and how that's affecting versus some of these long, chronic kind of
we do have a few anecdotal data showing that these events could really affect mortality. But it's not a long-term data set we have, so we can't really assess that question. So, yeah, there is mass mortality, there's no doubt about, but we do not know about the frequency. And if it comes to more extreme events, I would expect that this may have an effect, because this is then an added mortality to the ordinary one, and this may have an effect on the population levels.
Okay.
I wish just to add that I didn't reach it, the last slide in the talk. There is an increase in the number of dusty days in Tel Aviv that we published. And instead of about 15 days that we used to have in the 60s, in Tel Aviv, for example, we have now about, on the average, about 25 days per year.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, there's another question over there.
Yes, please.
If you could just raise your voice.
My question is why climate change doesn't seem to have any influence on invasive species, like ringneck parakeets or miners.
Now, there are well-known effects of climate change on invasive species, and particularly the parakeets. For example, in Germany, meanwhile, we have parakeets breeding in the Rhine Valley. And this happened because in the mid-60s, they escaped from a zoo, and they did not really reproduce for many, many decades. But now with the milder winters, they survive, and now they're able to reproduce, and the population is exploding, and it's now all along the Rhine Valley, and it's likely that they may affect local biodiversity.
In Israel, 70% of the birds that live in Israel, that breed in Israel, changed their manners or population size during the last 50 years. And 17 species were added to the number of species that breed in Israel. These 17 species, some of them came naturally by themselves, most of them. Some of them came due to human activity. Of these 17 species, 16 are tropical species. So in other words, apparently, I would say almost certainly, they were able to settle here because of the increase in temperature. Some of these animals are now restricted to the Arava in the south of Israel. But I guess that in the future, many of them will invade the Mediterranean region as well.
Thank you very much. More questions? Yes, please. Can you identify yourself?
My question is, we have a mantra here. 500 million birds pass north and south every year. But especially after hearing Dr. Leo Schwartz, my question is, are there really 500 million? Maybe it's down to 400 million or 350 million. How do we know there are really 500 million?
Good question. Who wants to answer?
I will answer. We had a big debate 20 years ago on Voice of America. They wanted to install a huge station in the Arava. So when we are talking on big numbers, the government, they said, this is a fake. The biologists, they just wanted to see the birds. So to get real data, we brought Professor Moderator from Switzerland, who had a radar, a Fledermaus radar, and he was following the migration on a scale of about 7 kilometers, yeah. And from his data, which he collected, he could follow each bird which crossing per time. And for the volume which he followed with his radar, he just multiplied it to the price of the country, and it came to 500 million. So maybe it's 400 or maybe it's 600 million, but basically that's the volume. Thank you.
Any more questions? Yes, please.
Maybe come to the microphone.
You mentioned that Israel is one of the Mediterranean subtropical areas that are drying out because of climate change. Could you briefly explain why?
Yes, briefly, indeed. The warming of the planet is causing the tropics to have larger convective upward motion and larger, also increased rainfall, which I mentioned in relation to the Nile. Now, if you learn a basic course in meteorology, when you have large upward motion in the tropics, it has somewhere to go down. It goes in the subtropics. Now, if you increase the convection, you increase the downward motion in the subtropics, and the downward motion is associated with less rainfall. This is very, very basic.
Okay, any more questions that the answer for them is very simple? Yes.
I want to comment on what Yoram said about those 17 species or those tropical species that spread into Israel, not also the invasive species. From the analysis that we did together and from observation, it's not the climate, it's the agriculture. We made ourselves a tropical country regarding vegetation, gardens, agriculture, and we didn't make ourselves a tundra country, or we did like in Abu Dhabi or Qatar, that they dropped ice and made a glacier. So this is why we have this species and we don't have the other species. But it's mainly man-made, and it's not the climate, it's the land use.
Yes, Ohad said what should have been said before. He is a co-author of the papers that I mentioned about the changes in animal population, or bird population in Israel. So what he says is what we wrote in the paper together.
I can add an example from Germany, which is not related to our landscape changes, and this is the bee-eater. The bee-eater was a classic Mediterranean species. It started breeding in Germany regularly in the mid-90s with a dozen pairs. Meanwhile, we have 700. And this is basically because of the warmer situation in Central Europe. And this is a species which is coming on its own, and we should separate the ones which are coming on their own as compared to the ones we introduce or translocate. This makes a lot of difference, because the ones which are coming on their own is part of nature. The other ones we are bringing into our environment, this is artificial, and they may have a serious impact.
Yes, please.
Then I would say, you're totally right, but the case in Israel is that at least in the desert, especially the desert, but not only, we completely changed it. And we have agriculture now that species, and the species also spread along agriculture that is spread along the Nile or from the east. So of course it's the climate as well, but without agriculture they won't be able to.
You may remember my last slide in my talk where I exactly pointed on that issue. So the climate change may top on some of the landscape changes we made already and we are continuing to do. And this is a more and more serious issue if it comes to biogeographical understanding of species distributions.
Any more? Okay.
It's a hard question for everyone. My name is Shmuel. You talked about the problem. Nobody talked about the solution. That's how you want us to come to this.
I seriously think that there is no solution to global warming.
The German governments will give the money, and then we have another lecture there on solutions.
I guess there are solutions. Sorry, I guess there are solutions, and this is habitat. We need to keep habitats, and then we will be able to enable the birds to adapt. And adaptability is the issue we need to have in mind. But for adaptability, it needs time and it needs habitats. And therefore, the prime interest must be preserving habitats for the annual cyclicity, in particular in migrants where we have to go to different places. And this needs to have in mind. Otherwise, if we restrict our activities to our home countries, we will fail completely in conserving migratory species in general. And so habitat preservation is the factor we can really do a lot.
If I may add, I can agree more. Obviously, adaptation is one, but it's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is the mitigation, and this is reduction of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. And I think that we need to close. So, but since most of you probably are bird people, but I would encourage you, if you have smartphones, to download the application of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework for Climate Change Convention, that is happening right now in the next few days and the next, actually 2 weeks in Lima. And you can download it, and it has all the news, all the information, linked to many reports, and also to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, which includes in its part 1 the physical issues related to climate change and the situation around the world. It will give some answers of why what's happening is really happening. And it has 2 other chapters, one on mitigation, one on adaptation, so it's worth looking at. It's a very extensive document, scientific document, and many references. So I guess we need to close now, right? Well, thank you, Yossi. And thanks you for the panel.
It is very common that after we close, somebody wants to say something. So, the issue of mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation, whatever we do in Israel to mitigate climate change, it will have very little effect on the global climate. Now, this is not a good excuse why we are not going to invest in mitigation, but this is the fact. However, adaptation provides direct benefits to us. So that if we make our biodiversity, give them opportunity to adapt to climate change, then first the most beneficiaries are us. And therefore it is our benefit to invest in adaptation. But when we want to invest in adaptation, we need to understand better what are the impacts of climate change on biodiversity in order to invest how to adapt them. And Marcelo mentioned something when he showed us the picture, the map of Israel with the climatic gradient. The fact that Israel, nearly all Israel, but especially the center part of Israel, is on gradient of climate. It is not only means that we have much rainfall in the north or very little rainfall in the south, but also the annual and between years variability of the climate is increasing. And it is most intensive in the area where the Mediterranean climate of Israel is touching the desert climate of Israel. And then in this area, the climate change back and forth between years, which means that the biodiversity in these areas are inherently adapted to climate change, to climate variations at least. So if we talk about priorities in preserving habitats in Israel, first of all, all Israel has a priority because it is in this climatic gradient, but especially the center part of Israel where the climate is a lot of time Mediterranean. Sometimes the desert comes into the Mediterranean climate, sometimes back. So we can do things that we are not doing yet, and therefore I think this meeting today has sharpened our visibility and our will to do something about it. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for all our lecturers. Thank you for your patience. And the group who are going now to the hula in 10 minutes, we will be with the bus here and we leave, okay? So thank you very much again.